I am here with Ray Kanzanese of Netscope Threat Labs, and we're going to discuss their new threat research report. So welcome, Ray.
Thanks for having me, Hugh.
Great. Good. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, before we launch into the discussion.
Yeah, sure. I got started doing technology protection. That was my sort of inroads to cybersecurity. So this was, making sure that software wasn't reversible by the recipients of that software. And that put me down this road where I started focusing more on malware, then eventually cloud security. I was CTO of a startup SIF security a few years back, and I've been with Netscope now running the threat labs for almost 4 years.
Terrific. So tell us about your new threat report.
Yeah, so the new threat report focuses on malware trends. And so what we were really looking at is, what types of malware are we seeing? Where is it coming from? Are we seeing anything new and different than we had been seeing previously? And a lot of it is stuff you would expect, right? Most of the malware we see is Trojans. About half of the malware downloads that we see happen from cloud apps instead of traditional websites, something that's been going on for a long time. The thing that really stood out the most when we were doing this research was a huge increase in PDFs and a similar huge increase in the number of downloads of those PDFs coming directly referred from Bing, Google, and Baidu, right? Three of the biggest search engines worldwide.
So tell me, so how does the attacker do that? What are these PDFs about? Are they on topics that are of general interest to people? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so most of the PDFs that we saw were named like forms that you would probably Google, meaning like I need FAFSA or I need a W-2, right? So it was lots of like tax forms and that kind of stuff. And so they would be named that way. The first page of all of them, like every single one of these PDFs that we found, was a fake CAPTCHA that was just like you click on the CAPTCHA and it redirects you either to like a phishing page or a malware download link or a scam, and the rest of the document was just SEO. So these things would be like 5 to 10 pages long of text there, themed to match the title of the PDF and the file name, and just really aiming to get them listed very highly on these search engines. And unfortunately it worked, right? They managed to in all three of those search engines get a lot of these PDFs listed very highly, and unfortunately that's not a place where people typically have their guard up, right? It's not like I got a weird email from somebody, right? And I'm not going to click on the link because I've taken, countless hours of trading telling me not to click on weird links and emails, right? This is like I was seeking out something and Google said, this is the thing I was seeking out. So I click on it and we saw an increase of, I think it was 4.5x the number of PDFs that we normally block on our platform, which is just a huge increase, right? Usually when we talk about increases, we're like, wow, that thing increased by 10% or 20%. Mm-hmm. That's a lot. 450% is just staggering. It clearly indicates that once somebody realized they were having success, they really dialed up their efforts to try to reach more people.
And what is the payload? Like what are these things doing to the victim?
Yeah. So we've seen a variety. So there were quite a few phishing pages, right? So it would just be a traditional phishing page, phishing for usually consumer credentials, right? So they're phishing for like your Amazon login, for example. We saw quite a few scams, right? Of like, please fill out this form because you've just won an iPhone, and all we need is your bank account number to ship it to you. And then we saw a few Trojans as well, right? And these were just, sort of commodity malware that was being distributed this way. So we didn't see anything super targeted, right? Because obviously this isn't a great targeted way to launch a campaign. This was more of like the spray and pray, the get these things listed there and just hope people find them and click on them.
And in terms of mitigating a threat like this, I mean, are there, if you have like a basic security package on your PC, are they going to flag this, or is this going to slip through? What happens there?
So yeah, if you have any sort of web controls, right? Like if you're behind a secure web gateway or something, obviously that's going to inspect and block this type of content. AV, I mean, we didn't exhaustively test AV solutions, right? But this, is typically a PDF, right? That's loaded up in the browser. That's usually good enough for your AV to find that malicious PDF in your temp folder and say this was malicious and block it. It's just sort of a race condition, right? Does the browser render it before the AV was, managed to detect and block it? And that's, the thing that, we're just not in the business of that, right? We weren't trying to grade AVs on how quickly they were able to block this, but most AV should be able to detect and block these types of PDFs.
So let's switch back to what you said before, which was downloading Trojans and malware from cloud apps. Can you give me an example of what that might look like?
Yeah, sure. So when you look at the types of cloud apps that we see downloads of malware from, those cloud apps are typically just the most popular cloud apps. So that top list always has and will continue to include, Box, Google Drive, Dropbox, OneDrive, because those are places, right, that the victims of the malware downloads, right, are all using. So they're more likely to click on those links. And so we just get attackers using those basically as free file hosting platforms, right? They're just uploading files there and distributing them how they normally would. So we've seen a lot of emails, right, of please check this invoice, right? But instead of an attachment of the invoice, right, it's a link to download the invoice from Dropbox or Box, right? We have seen a little bit of attackers being a little bit more clever and using features of those apps to distribute them as well. So, for example, you upload something to Dropbox and then you click share, right? And then you use that share feature to share that with a bunch of email addresses. And then Dropbox sends that email that says somebody shared a document with you. And so we have seen a little bit of that as well. But it's still overwhelmingly, SMS, phishing, social media, sharing links. It's just that those links are not to malicious websites anymore, compromised sites. They're more and more just links to Dropbox and Google Drive, and really, I mean, it was hundreds of cloud apps that we saw these downloads coming from. So I'm not trying to pick on anybody, right? I'm just saying that it is a problem across the board, right? Anybody who can create a free account can upload whatever they want to any of these cloud app platforms.
Interesting. Okay, so that's useful, because when I was originally thought you were talking about people sort of like taking over a cloud app and then using it as a sort of like as a vehicle for malware, but you're saying it's really just they're parking malicious files in these apps or that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Also sounds very difficult to defend against,
It certainly makes it depends on how you defend, right? So if your main defense is I have a block list of malicious domains, right? Then that's not going to help, right? Because then your only hope is to block something like Google Drive, right, in order to block all the malware from there. And obviously we're not suggesting that, right? These cloud applications are incredibly useful and valuable, and we get lots of positive effects from them, right? This is more about just making sure that your protection for malware downloads, right, is paying attention to the cloud app traffic, right? Make sure you don't have a rule that says, like we were worried that all this Google Drive traffic would overwhelm our anti-malware solution, so we just bypassed all the Google Drive traffic, right? That's a bad idea, right? This idea of zero trust, of like don't trust anything, applies to everything, right? Cloud apps included, right? Just because it's your preferred vendor and everybody's using it doesn't mean that somebody can also be abusing it.
Right. So that's interesting. So yeah. So let's talk about how the enterprise can handle this. So one thing is you have to be filtering your files that are downloaded, and then um, having controls over these kind of cloud platforms. What other things can an enterprise do to mitigate threats like that from cloud applications?
Yeah, so obviously we talked about endpoints earlier, right? So
Right.
if you have EDR or something on your endpoints, for malware protection, that's going to apply regardless of where the malware is getting downloaded from, right? The EDR doesn't care that the download came from drive.google.com or from
Hmm.
some malicious URL. So
Hmm.
certainly, just endpoint protection is a useful defense here as well.
Are there other like let's pretend that I'm the CSO or CASO of a Fortune 500 company. Um, I, I'd have a nicer home office if that were the case. But the the like, what would you tell me to watch out for in as terms of cloud threats? Aside from the SEO and the cloud apps, any other things I should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so the two things that we've been seeing a lot more of that are a lot harder, frankly, to detect and prevent than the malware delivery are cloud apps being used for command and control,
Hmm.
and just general phishing around cloud apps. And so for command and control, the concept of it is easy, right? Like an attacker used to before have to create their own server, right? And they've got their server running somewhere and
Hmm.
using that for sending and receiving commands or as a dead drop resolver, right? And so what we've seen people doing instead is using Slack for that command and control message, right? We've seen YouTube used as a dead drop resolver, right? We've seen Dropbox, we've seen Google Drive, Telegram, OneDrive, right? We've seen so many different cloud apps both being used for one-way communication, two-way communication, dead drop resolvers, where it becomes a lot harder, right? If you've got an IPS, right, and you have all these signatures around C2 profiles, it's really hard to write a C2 signature on your IPS for a cloud app because how do you differentiate between normal use of that cloud app and this command and control traffic? So this becomes a little bit more challenging of a problem. And then the phishing is similar, right? And so, for one, we've seen attackers phishing for cloud app credentials, right? Because obviously, if you can compromise somebody's, my Google account or my OneDrive account, you have essentially access to all the files that I have access to at work and my work email account. And so that's a good place for an attacker to pivot somewhere else. And so we've seen that happening through normal phishing pages and through phishing pages that attackers host on the services whose credentials they're phishing for, right? So what's a good way to get people to click and enter their credentials for Microsoft 365? Well, host that phishing page on Azure websites, because then it's going to be hosted on a Microsoft owned domain. And, if you have trained people to say, make sure you recognize that domain, make sure there's a green check mark, make sure that certificate's issued to who you think it's issued to, you end up at these pages where it looks like the official login page. It's hosted on, for Azure websites, it'll be windows.net, which is owned by Microsoft, and the certificate will be issued to Microsoft. And so it's a little harder, right, for anybody but the most sophisticated users to recognize that. And then the sort of most advanced flavor of this that we've seen is instead of phishing for credentials, fish for tokens, and do that by creating a fake app that you're just trying to convince people to say, I would like this app to have access to, and click accept at that dialogue. And that's the one that I think it makes me most nervous, because there's typically no phishing page, right? That's just the app created that you're trying to get people to click on. And as soon as they click accept, it doesn't matter if they have MFA, right? The attacker just instantly has access to whatever it is they requested.
Do you have a sense? First of all, that's very helpful. But just going on, do you have a sense of what these attackers look like? And are they organizations, or what kind of entities are they? I mean, are like who's attacking in these sophisticated attacks?
So it's across the board, right? And so I think you use the word sophisticated,
Hmm.
and I think that a lot of this stuff that I'm describing, right, like cloud command and control and cloud phishing, it was sophisticated at one point, but I don't think I would not view that as sophisticated anymore because the set of attackers that we see doing this is all of them. It's been around long enough that there's enough code lying around that people are starting to reuse and reuse where it's not sophisticated attackers doing this, right? It's really across the board. So we have seen, APT groups using these techniques, but we've also seen very low effort commodity threats using these techniques. For example, we found somebody who accidentally put their Telegram, their email address, and their phone number in the phishing pages they were running off of Azure websites. Right? That's not a sophisticated attacker, right? In fact, it was just somebody trying to make some money on the side that heard that this was easy and was using a template created by somebody else. So it's really most of this stuff at this point has become a commodity, which is why we're seeing it so much.
Interesting, because I think one of the things, I mean, I'm sure that professionals understand this, but I think the general business person or consumer doesn't understand who's attacking them. They think it's like some kid in a hoodie in the basement, and it's more like an organization or some kind of marketplace where people buy the tools to do the hacking, and it's automated. Like my cousin calls and says, I threw away one of my checks in the garbage. I'm worried someone's going to read the check and get my account number. I'm thinking, you shouldn't worry about that. It's much more like some automated thing is going to be scanning, for an open port, or it's phishing for you, and will get your bank account information that way. They're not going to be going through the trash necessarily. But it's a misconception based on old ideas. Well, good. So what other advice, why don't we wrap up with, if you have any other advice for, I focus mostly on corporate, like for corporate security people to think about in terms of cloud, being aware of cloud threats, mitigating cloud threats. What other advice might you have for them looking forward?
Yeah, so I think like broadly, my advice, right, is don't just blindly trust cloud apps.
Hmm.
That we're all using them now. Make sure that we are locking things down, inspecting things, and paying attention to where the threats are going. Right. Make sure we're inspecting for malware downloads. Make sure we have some way to identify if a cloud app account is compromised. Right. If somebody's managed to fish their way into one of our users' accounts, make sure that we are prepared to respond, and make sure we've just locked them down, right? A lot of these things you can actually control. You don't have to allow your users to authorize anything they want access to whatever they want, right? You can actually go into these control panels and say, I would only like users to authorize approved plugins, or I'd like an admin to review these. So there's a lot of stuff you can do just to make it harder, and then just make sure that you are monitoring and aware when these things happen.
Interesting. All right. Well, it's really an evergreen topic. So I'm sure we'll come back and talk about this again at some point in the future, when your next threat report comes out. But in the meantime, thank you for being with us today, and it was a very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Hugh.
Talk to you later.
Bye.